Okay. Thank you, Sheila. Can people hear me all right? Good. I'm the Director of Research at the Sutton Trust, and the Sutton Trust is a charity that works with young people from across the United Kingdom. We have, for example, 250 students who go to summer schools. These are young people who are doing their hires in Scotland or A-levels in England, who go to our summer schools at Edinburgh and St Andrews universities. But our mission is social mobility, and we're about making sure that young people fulfil their potential, particularly those from low and low-middle income backgrounds. So as well as running programmes for perhaps 4,000 young people a year across the UK, we also commission research, around 15 research studies a year. We've commissioned, since the Sutton Trust was founded nearly 20 years ago, we've commissioned around 170 pieces of research, of which the Access in Scotland report on Friday was the latest. And the reason we commissioned the Access in Scotland report was twofold. The first was I had the privilege of serving on behalf of the Sutton Trust on the Commission on Widening Access recently, which produced some very powerful recommendations, which I'm pleased to see the Scottish Government is minded to accept. And we felt that the Commission's recommendations needed to be boosted and that the policy debate on access shouldn't finish with the Commission, so we wanted to encourage the sort of debate which I think it's fair to say there was on the media here on Friday. But we also wanted to look for ourselves at the data, and one of the things I found when I was on the Commission, knowing the level of data and the discussion that there quite often is about data in England, was that data is not quite so readily available in Scotland. And I think one of the points of commissioning the excellent report which we had from Sheila and her colleagues was really to highlight that, to highlight what data is available, but also to make the case that we need more data. Because one of the things I know from the work that I've done research for the Sutton Trust and the Sutton Trust has found over the years is that data is crucial to social mobility. And unless we know what the problem is, unless we're able to diagnose the problem, we're not able to solve the problem. And that's really what today is about as well. It's about presenting some of the findings of the research, and we have 3 of the researchers doing that. We'll have a response from Professor Jim Gallagher. There will be an opportunity to ask some questions as we go along, but a few questions as we go along, because there will then be, before lunch, an extensive time for discussion and reflection, so that hopefully we have some lessons that we can take away from this morning's proceedings. Without any further ado, could I ask Lucy Hunter-Blackburn, who is currently studying for a PhD here, but was formerly working for the Scottish Government on higher education policy, so brings the benefit of a policy background as well as an academic background to the question of how do Scotland and England perform, and in particular discussing a little of the role of colleges in this, which, as those of you who will be familiar with the media debate on Friday will know, was one of the issues that was being raised there. Lucy.
Thank you. Grace is just going to find my slides. Thank you very much. So I'm going to compare the levels of participation in higher education in Scotland and in England. Where I can, I want to bring in, thank you, so can people hear me? Very important. Good. Good, thank you. I'm going to bring in where I can other parts of the UK, and wherever the data lets me, I'll analyse the numbers a bit further by student's background. So, next thing I need to do is work out what we're pressing here. Good. So a word about making comparisons like these. The main purpose of doing this is to help us understand, I think, to understand better the dynamics that are at work in our own system, things that we might find it harder to see if we just look at it in isolation. Sorry about that feedback. I'm hoping it's sorted. So there are 2 main data sets I'm going to talk about. So the first one is the UCAS entry rate at age 18, and that's produced by the University and College Admission Service. The other is the Higher Education Initial Participation Rate, or for short, the HEIPR, and that goes right up to age 30. And I'm going to talk about both of those. And the second of these in particular lets us look at how higher education provided in colleges fits into this bigger story. So let's start with UCAS. I'm going to put up a slide. This is some technical detail about the UCAS data. It's really there, so you have it in your pack. I won't talk it right through, but the main point about these numbers, as many people note, is they don't include those who go at 18 into a further education college in Scotland, and then to do a higher education course of maybe 1 or 2 years, and then possibly for them may move on to university. And that's why we'll need to come back later to the HEIPR, which has a broader scope. However, and this is a really important point, I think, we shouldn't dismiss the UCAS data because of this particular aspect. The UCAS figures are a good and reliable basis on which to compare how likely it is that someone is going to go straight into university, more or less straight from school. And there are some real advantages to going that way, as I'll discuss later. So one further slide, just with some technical detail about measurement of age. Again, I won't talk it through, but it might be thought, it might be reasonably expected that taking just one age group at 18 as a snapshot might affect the way comparisons work because of differences in the school system. And it turns out there is some issue, but in fact, if anything, I think it looks like the English figures are the ones that are slightly understated as a result of that snapshot approach. So, okay, and one very last point of introduction. UCAS uses a classification of disadvantage called Polar 3. And it divides the UK into small areas, and it groups these according to the level of participation in all forms of higher education. So you're going to see a lot in a minute of slides with the label Q1. And where you see Q1, that's the most disadvantaged 20% of areas. And you'll see Q5. Q5 is the most advantaged. That's the thing to hang on to here. UCAS data is also available using the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, which I imagine many people in this room will know well, because it's what we tend to use here. As it happens, if you compare the Polar figures and the SIMD figures, they look pretty similar for Scotland. They're slightly worse for the disadvantage, they're slightly better for the top 20%, so the gap between the two is a little wider. But for comparisons across the UK, we need to use Polar. So let's have a look at the number of 18-year-olds who go in through UCAS, and there are going to be little graphs here, I apologise in advance, the number of people who go in at 18 on average, and for each of the two groups I've mentioned. And what you'll see there is that Scotland has lower figures, so the red bar is Scotland, the grey one is England, has lower figures in all cases, and the gap is largest for the most disadvantaged, and it's larger as well between the most and least disadvantaged compared to England. So if I do that as a percentage, you'll see the average, the Scottish figure is 78% of the English. For Q1, it's just 56%. Now, what we can say is there are some, what might be driving these differences. I'll stick in Wales in it and as well, and Northern Ireland. So Wales there in green, Northern Ireland in pink. And you'll see again, we're still sitting at the bottom here. So what might be driving the difference between the UK nations here? Well, it turns out we can shed quite a lot of light on why we sit where we do in this graph by looking at some more of the UCAS numbers that are available. And the first thing to do is to look at the application rates, because very basically, how likely people are to enter depends, first of all, on how likely they are to apply. So I'm going to take you through the application rates. Here's the application rate data. Same idea as before, the average, the most disadvantaged at Q1, the least disadvantaged at Q5. You'll see again there's a gap, but it's actually a little bit smaller this time between Scotland and England. I can put some averages in here. So the average is 91%, Q1 74. Q5 rather interestingly 91%, and I know that looks odd that you have two 91s. It can be explained, but I won't stop and do it now because of time. So what we can definitely see, what's really obvious here, is that the application rate for the most disadvantaged in Scotland is now 74% of the English figure, whereas for the entry rate, it was 56%. So in Scotland, what we can say is that young people are less likely to apply to university at 18, but they're not so much less likely that it explains all the difference in their entry rate. I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense? I'm looking, a bit of nodding is good. So we've done some of our storytelling, but we've not done the whole thing. As you'll see, application rate, again, varies in both countries by background. Okay? And the effect is a bit stronger again in Scotland. I'll stick in Wales, because it is interesting to stick in. You see Wales is there, there's Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland has very high application rates. And you'll see that, again, we've got Wales, interestingly, is actually on average it's slightly lower than us, but not for either of the groups shown. So there's a bit more to look at. So the other part of the story I would like to take you through, which explains some of these gaps in the entry rate, is what happens at the acceptance rate. Now, the acceptance rate effectively measures how successful applicants are, and it's a really important bit of data, and we don't look at it actually all that much. One of the things that was good to have the space to do, courtesy of the Sutton Trust, was to spend some time on that data. So I'm going to show you the acceptance rate for each UK nation. This is new data for the Trust, broken down by background. And I'm going to spend some time on these numbers. So just to start off with one. This is the acceptance rate for the most disadvantaged young people in Scotland in 2015 at age 18. It was 65%. That means that 910 young people from these areas applied and 605 were successful. That gives you 65%. Are we happy? This is, yeah, I'm contented. Right. I'm not a very good maths teacher at the front here. Okay, I'm going to give you the English data. So England gives you 84%. Same calculation, so it's quite a lot higher. What that tells you is that for every 3 people from Q1 areas who applied in Scotland, 2 got a place, whereas in England it was 5 out of 6. Okay, so I'll put in the rest of Scotland. And what you'll see there, as levels of advantage rise, so do success rates. We get to 78% for the most advantage, and then I'll stick in England. Now what you'll see with England, and this is really interesting, is that the figures are higher, but they're also flatter by background. There's less effects. From where you come from doesn't seem to have as much effect on your success rates. So in plain words, Scottish applicants are less likely to be successful in general than English ones, and their success rates vary more by background. And this turns out to be quite an important part of what we're looking for in this data. So what's likely to be causing this effect? Well, from other data we have, and that you'll hear about later, it's clear that Scottish institutions tend to have higher entry requirements. And that would certainly explain both the lower overall success rates of Scottish applicants and also why social background matters more, because of course we know that there's a very strong link between exam results and school background, social background. Okay, I'll bring in the rest of the UK again, because again it's interesting. Here's Wales, in green, and then it's all Wales, the new ones there, so not all green. Wales looks a lot like England, but slightly better actually. And I'll stick in Northern Ireland because they're quite interesting. Northern Ireland are a lot like us, but a bit worse. And I could tell you why I think that's the case, but again, I won't stop and do that now. One last useful thing to look at here is what's happened over time in the acceptance rate, because again, that sheds quite a bit of light. So here's the patterns for, let me get this. Right, what this tells you is for for all 5 of the different types of background, what the acceptance rate has looked like over time, and it layers up, so the more advantaged you are, the better your success rates. And what you'll see that Scotland there on the right, it's not new that we have this bigger gap by background in England, that's quite well established. But what is new and interesting is that the size of that gap has grown, and that's clearer if I do this. I'll stick them together. And what you'll see that at the start of the period, the acceptance rates for the most advantaged in Scotland look pretty close to those in England. But as we've sort of gone over the past decade, the two systems have pulled apart, so all our acceptance rates are now lower. And the Q1 group, it's worth saying, hasn't actually dropped as much as the others in Scotland, but the trend for them even since 2012 has been downwards. Now what we can do, because I've looked at this, is discount any differences due to pressures on each system. The volume of applications has grown very similarly, very amazingly similarly in both countries actually. So instead, I think what we're seeing here is a difference in response to rising demand. And what you're looking at, I think, is one system, England's, which seems to have expanded more or less at the same rate as interest has risen, while the other, ours in Scotland, appears to have increased its capacity less quickly. We have increased, but not as fast. And I think that's what's driving these numbers. So a quick summary. What explains our combination of lower application and lower acceptance rates is unique in the UK. Other people have different combinations, but we're the only one who have those two. And that explains the differences in our entry rates at 18. For the most disadvantaged, in fact, if I do a bit more maths, I could show you that the difference is more or less explained equally by lower application and lower acceptance rates for the Q1 group. And I think that the lower acceptance rates for Scots through UCAS are likely to be related to a tighter supply of university places, and the greater difference by background is likely to relate to the higher entrance requirements we can see in other data sets. Okay, so that's about 18-year-olds who go straight to university. That's my take on how that works. But we do need to look more broadly. So here's the HEIPR. And the HEIPR is a measure, a broader measure that's only available for Scotland and England. It measures entry rates up to 30, up to the age of 30. It covers all forms of higher education. So it includes those going into college in Scotland. It's much more comprehensive. And it includes part-timers going into the OU, for example, who we didn't have before. Now, a point to note is that this measure looks what door you first walk through to get into the system. It doesn't look at where you finish, and I will come back to that. So here's the English figures, just start with England. What you can see happening in England there is it rises and there's a clear spike in 2011 as people try to get under the wire of the higher fees that came in 2012. It dips in 2012, we knew that, and then it begins to look like it's recovering in 2013-14. We don't have a more recent year for them. We did ask the government department in England, BIS, who produced these figures, if they could split this down for us by type of institution, by university, by college, but they couldn't, at least they haven't been able to yet. However, by looking at some other data, we can be pretty sure that university level provision dominates that line. Maybe about 6% of it might be being produced in FE colleges and other sort of sub-university level provision, but it's almost all university. Happily, thanks to the Scottish Funding Council, who've been very, very helpful here, we can build this figure up by type of institution. So that's what I'm going to do. So this here, these bars, that tells you what proportion of people by the age of 30 went into higher education by going directly into university, a university in Scotland specifically for these figures here. It's about 1/3, you'll see. The labels I've given you there for the highest and the lowest years, as well as the beginning and the end. And what you'll see, there's not really much of a trend in that data. To the extent there's any trend at all, it's a bit lower in the last 4 years than it was in the first 4 years. So you'll notice that 13-14 is lower than 6-7. I'll add in, because we probably need to do that, the people who went across border to universities in the rest of the UK. So there they are, not many. And you'll see there again, there's unsurprisingly a drop in 2012. And now I will add in the people who went into college. And it gets very interesting at this point. So there you go. That's our college data. Yeah, that's my reaction as well when I read it. The figures. So you'll see what happens when we look at the people who go through college. It makes a huge difference, and we come kind of bursting through and end up with a much higher set of numbers. And it's not an absolutely steady trend, but there's clearly been, unlike the blue bars, we can see there's a definite rising trend in those numbers. I'll just replace the college labels with the total HEIPR. There we go. And again, similar thing, not quite a rising, well, it's a rising trend, but not steady. And this rise in the HEIPR, what this tells us is it was due entirely to increased entry through the doors of colleges. That's a really significant point here. And as I mentioned before, of those first entering through college, there will be a substantial number in that sort of pinkish shaded bar who will go on to university in the end. But surprisingly, perhaps, none of the measures, none of the many data sets that are available tell us in Scotland what percentage of that pink bar are going to up in university, either in total or by different types of background either. So it's really difficult to put data sets together. I think it's about 40%, but that's a bit of a rough estimate on my part. So probably, by sight, taking into account there's a bit of non-university provision in that black line for England, it's pretty likely the total proportion of the whole population who eventually gets a university degree or gets into university is quite similar. But it would be nice to be able to say that in a slightly more specific way. Now, one thing we can do is we can look at this data, again, thanks to the SFC, by background. We can't compare the nations by background on this measure because, again, the data's not there for England. However, the Scottish data is. So I'm going to show you just one last graph, and it's this one. This shows you the people by background. So on the left-hand side there, you've got, this time we're using the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation because we can. MD20 on the left is the most disadvantaged 20%. LD20 on the right there is the most advantaged. And that's telling you the proportion of people by the age of 30 who start off in a Scottish HEI. That's what the blue bar is, and then there's a tiny little white bar, that's the cross-border people. Now, you can see how very much difference that makes. So you've got a growth in the left-hand side, but it's not a huge growth. But the really striking thing about these figures, obviously, is how much bigger the blue bar is on the right-hand side than it is on the left. Now I'm going to add in the college data. My bars have changed colour, apologies. But the pink bar there is your college data. Now what that's showing you very clearly is that the college track is more important for the most disadvantaged. In absolute terms, it's more important in relative terms. That's very, very striking. You can see there that for them now, it's over time has been really the only way the growth has come. And in fact, the Commission on Widening Access did notice, I'll just put in, that dotted line tells you what everything adds up to for each group. The Commission on Widening Access rightly noted that growth in the total participation in MD20, but what they didn't pick up was that 90% of that growth had come from entry through college. Now again, some of these students will go on to university. It's important to note that, but what proportion is pretty much impossible to say from the published data. Meanwhile, over on the right-hand side, you can see the most advantaged are still much more likely to start their higher education in university. And that accounts for 3/4 of their initial entry. So what becomes a really important question, I think, not just for comparing systems across borders, but social equity within Scotland, is does it matter what level of higher education a person does, and whether they enter university direct or whether they're going via college? And that's what I'm going to spend the last few minutes talking about. And I'm going to just leave that up there for a second, just so you've got it, and then I'll move on. So, okay, entry via college. First of all, I do say college level higher education, I absolutely agree. It's a valuable part of what we have. It's an extremely useful avenue into higher education for lots of people. I want to make that point before I make anything else, because I don't want people to misunderstand what I'm saying here. However, there are some real downsides, I think, to relying on it too much as a route into higher education for the most disadvantaged. And the first one is this one. What evidence we have, and we could have better evidence to be honest on this, what evidence we have suggests that the earnings boost from an HN qualification is not as high as it is from a degree. And that's not at all surprising, because it's not going to give access to anything like the same range of occupations and professions. And to take the Sutton Trust point about social mobility, it's not just about earnings. It would be a mistake to see the issue about these kind of what career tracks as purely an earnings point. It's about influence. It's about power in society. It's all kinds of things like that. And the HNs just don't push you into those kind of roles in the same way. Of the remainder who go on to university, which you'll recall I estimated might be as many as 40%, we do know that less than half of that group, just under half, will obtain no credit or only partial credit for all the time they spent at college. And I think we need to talk about that way more. It means they're going to have to repeat 1 or more years of their studies. It means they'll be looking at 5 or 6 years to get to an honours degree. And that tends to be particularly true for those who are going into one of the older universities. Now, that's potentially twice as long as it might take someone from the same background to get an honours degree in England. It demands, therefore, an awful lot more staying power. But more to the point, it means more years of funding for their own living costs. And a point that I do a lot of work on, which is student support, I would draw attention to the fact that almost all that living cost support now has to come as loan in Scotland. There's very little grant. It also means, and the state can hardly ever compensate enough for this one, higher opportunity costs than those who did the course in the usual time. It takes you longer. Your entry to the labour market is delayed. That matters too. For the rest who do move on to university and who can get full credit, their choice of subject and institution will be a lot more limited. So direct entry into the third year of law or medicine here or at Glasgow is not going to happen with an HND, or at least the case study you find me for that will be an absolute exception. Last of all, we need to acknowledge, I think, that while some students definitely do benefit, I'm looking at Lynn here, Lynn's done a lot of work on transitions, there are certainly some students who benefit from a stepwise transition from college to university. There are others for whom going straight into the first year might have been easier than dealing with the various forms of upheaval that are involved in joining a programme and a group of students in year 2 or year 3. So, growth in movement from colleges to universities has generally been seen as a positive thing here, and of course that's true, where it's providing a route for people into university who would otherwise just not have felt able. They wouldn't have thought of it, or they wouldn't have felt able to do it. But given what we saw earlier, the acceptance rate data, I showed you the greater difficulty over time of getting in, I think we need to ask ourselves how far some of that recent growth in articulation might be down to people who wanted direct entry to university and felt ready for that, but defaulted to college because that was where they could get a place. Okay. And that's maybe quite a challenging thought, because we tend to celebrate articulation in a fairly straightforward way. Sometimes we have to admit some things can be good and they can be not so good at the same time. So some closing remarks here, and sorry for a lot of graphs in this one, but it was unavoidable. but no graphs. This is it. I'm all done with my graphs. A few points for debate, which I think emerge from these numbers. So first of all, I think we should maybe dwell a bit at some point on why does social background have a larger effect on likelihood of applying in Scotland than England? We need to explain that. We need to talk more about the overall supply of places, greater competition, and the effect that's having on acceptance rates. As you'll gather, I feel quite strongly about the issue of additional costs involved with repeat years and other issues to do with articulation. And we need to talk about more frankly, I think. And there is one very difficult issue here, which is the comparability of different types of HE and how far entry into college to do an HN might be compared with entry into what we call a lower tariff institution in England, of which there are far more. So I want to make one general closing observation. The difference between England and Scotland is generally described and framed, indeed, in terms of being between a market and a non-market ideology. And I think these figures, for me, bring out a different philosophical, if you like, contrast. I think, on the one hand, what we can see here in Scotland is a less expanded system, has expanded, let's be clear, but a less expanded system, which is more traditionally funded, is setting higher entry qualifications, and it's relying on the colleges to absorb much of the rising demand that it can't meet, particularly from kids from working class backgrounds, to be honest. Now that contrasts with the creation of a larger and more various system in England that offers more routes in, straight into university, particularly for young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds. Now Scotland, in effect, you might say, is adhering there to a slightly older, more selective concept of university education. Now, some might argue, I won't be honest about this, some might argue that that is right. People in this room might well want to defend that. But we do need to recognise that as an approach, it presents greater challenges when it comes to getting more disadvantaged young people into university. So indeed, I think from the numbers analysed here, this contrast in ways of thinking about what a university system is there for and how big it should be, explains a significant part of the difference between the Scottish and English systems, the data difference between Scotland and England for direct entry into university for younger people from more disadvantaged areas. And that's me.
Thank you, Lucy. So we're going to do about 5 minutes of questions to Lucy, and given that it's just 5 minutes, could I suggest that I take 3 questions, which...
Oops, yep. I'm still plugged in.
With Mike, Lucy answers. So if when you're asking the question, if you could stand up and if you could say who you are as well, that would be really helpful. Could I see three questions then, please? Don't be shy. So one at the front here.
David Cameron. I'm interested in the view on social mobility, which was seen as a key purpose of widening access, and I've got a concern that we're focusing too much on social mobility for individuals, so we cut across the principle of rise with your class and not beyond it. And I'm just interested in exploring that idea both from the Sutton Trust point of view and from the research point of view of what we actually mean by social mobility and what we hope will come from widening access.
Okay. Second question. One at the back and one at the front.
Hi, Ali Jarvis. I had a question for Lucy. Given we know exactly how many additional places for articulation and widening access were put into the system and at what point, did you do any calculations that actually took those places out and to see what effect that would have on the trends?
Okay, and one question at the front as well here.
Niels Tromes. We assume that people are making rational choices all the way along in whether they apply to university or college and join that route, or whether they're going to other positive destinations. I feel your story might be made all the more stronger by having access to longitudinal data that can follow individual choices through a look at those cumulative effects of choices and see whether that affects social mobility. Do you think that there is enough investment in longitudinal surveys in Scotland and in the UK more widely?
Okay, Lucy, would you like to have a go at that? And I'll say a little bit about social mobility at the end as well.
I'll leave most of the social mobility to Connor, but I think it does matter. I mean, one of the things, I'm going to digress here, I did a quick survey of who sat in the Scottish Parliament recently and where they'd gone and done their higher education of the new entrants. And of the 40-odd for whom I could get the data, 2 had just got as far as college and no further, and 28 had gone to university, of whom almost well over half had gone to what you might call the Russell Group. So I mean, it matters, I think, because it's about the voices that you hear in public debate. Who's there? Who's shaping the news I hear? Where are the journalists? Huge complaint that the newsrooms of Britain are increasingly full of people from private schools because no one else can afford to become a journalist. So for me, it matters a lot as a person who wants to be in a world where the voices and experience of people are from everywhere. So I absolutely agree with you. There's a very plucking individuals and just putting them over here is not what it's about. But a society which is very socially immobile and becoming more so if we're not careful. It's about voices and power for me. It's a much more complex thing than just wanting to grab individuals, but I'll let Connor embellish that. Ali's point, did we calculate? No, I can't, I don't think, because the UCAS data that we've got, possibly, we could. I'm just trying to work out if I actually could. From the main UCAS data, it would be quite hard to take out the extra places, I think. But it's an interesting question. I haven't done it. It would certainly affect some of the data that we've got on the higher tariffs and how quickly we saw a very sharp rise in the proportion of young people from poorer backgrounds who went into high tariff institutions in Scotland over the period of that scheme, and I can't think of any other reason for that. Across the system as a whole, there might just have been a little bit of displacement. It's possible that it was more moving people from one kind of university to another. It's hard to tell. So I think Ali, I'm not sure whether we could do that calculation, but it's an interesting one about what would happen if we had done it. Certainly our conclusion was that it had been an important scheme, and if we'd looked at any levers that had been pulled in Scotland in recent years, that was the one where you could track something in the data, most obviously. And your last question about longitudinal data, absolutely, it would be great. The person, I mean, I've read a lot of stuff that I think Hazel Christie has done here over the last decade, where she's interviewed people about their choices and she's done some really interesting work. But what we haven't had is that longitudinal stuff, and it would be great to have a really good cohort study through about how people make their decisions and where they end up. But we don't really have it.
Thank you, Lucy. Just briefly on social mobility, because I don't want to delay getting on to the next speaker. I mean, for us, I suppose it's about two things. It's about making sure that every young person, whatever their background, has the chance to fulfil their potential, and whatever that potential may be. So it's not just about who's going to be members of the Scottish Parliament or members of the Westminster Parliament or newspaper editors or wherever, but it is about changing those, and it is about making sure that those people who are setting the agenda actually reflect the society whose agenda they are shaping better than they do at present. But it is also about making sure that young people, whatever their background, fulfil their potential. And if, in this case, their potential is to go to university and they're limited because there's a lack of places or a lack of information or a lack of access to getting decent hires, well, then they're important concerns to us. So that really for us is what social mobility is about. And I think the one thing on the longitudinal that I think is quite interesting is the potential now, and Anna Vignoles has been doing some of this at Cambridge, the potential for matching with HMRC data that is starting to be explored. And there was a study she did for the Institute for Fiscal Studies recently, just makes it a little more possible to start doing a bit more and delving a bit more into this data. And I think over the next few years we will be able to have some richer data, hopefully both in Scotland and in England. We will have more time for discussion later on this morning, but could I now introduce Dr. Elizabeth Whedon, another co-author of the report and Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Research in Education, Inclusion and Diversity here. And she is going to talk specifically about the social inclusivity of selective universities in Scotland and England. This, of course, is an issue that we're very keen on finding more about, because our summer school programme particularly is very much focused on this, on the selected universities.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Yep. And what I want to say is that the data that we're using here complements what we have been doing in other parts of the report that you might have had time to read. But it's focusing specifically at HESA data that is published. So it's administrative HESA data that's published annually. And we haven't gone into the the sort of detail that you would get in a data set that would have all the student data in it. And just as a bit of a background, expansion in higher education, which you will know about in the last sort of 2 decades, and a much stronger focus on non-traditional students, particularly those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, but also students who in other ways were non-traditional, for example, disabled students. And the expansion of the higher education sector, especially in the 1990s, which led to an increasing stratification. So we're looking at the impact of that kind of stratification. And alongside that was an increase in monitoring of institutions over that period, which stemmed in part from the Deering report in 1997, and the creation of performance indicators. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on, the performance indicators, which gather quantitative data to look at, in this case, specifically the widening participation performance indicators. And I would like to say at this point, although there's been all this rhetoric around widening participation, we started in that period, the progress has been relatively slow, particularly to elite institutions. So this presentation examines widening participation using the UK-wide PIs and their associated benchmarks. I'm going to say just a little bit more about the 2 PIs for widening participation. They are UK-wide, so we can make comparisons. But as has been thrown up by the data that Lucy is looking at, there are some problems in the kind of comparisons we're making, in particular because of the fact that we don't have colleges in there and we don't have the widening participation indicators picking up on students in Scotland in colleges. The 2 indicators that are used, and again, I'll caution about them a little bit because there's been a big review of the indicators that should be used. So the 2 that we're using here will only be in use until 2017. There are a range of other ones that are being looked at just now, but I'm not sure whether they've actually settled on which ones are going to be used. Free school meals has been one, I think, that's been mentioned. Low participation schools has been another one, and I think parental level of education as well. But currently, what's known as NSEC 4 to 7, that's the National Statistics Social and Economic classification, is used, and 4 to 7 indicates roughly what we would call working class background. There are other ways of grouping these ones because there's a scale on 1 to 7 plus 8, which is unemployed people. And some people group it into 3. HESA groups it into 2, 1 to 3 and 4 to 7. And the second, and that covers the occupational status of students' highest earning parent or carer. The second widening participation indicator that's used at the moment is the type of school attended, whether it's a state school or an independent school. And as I already mentioned, there's been some disquiet about that because there are big differences between state schools. And in Scotland, certainly 95% of kids go to state schools. So it's not necessarily a particularly sensitive indicator. These PIs focus on young full-time students. That's those that are below 21 who are entering first year of higher education. So we're not looking at all here of the application stage. And I think it's important to have the data that Lucy does looking at the application rates. It does include, there are 2 tables that HESA publishes. One is only what they call first degree students, which is degrees, full degrees up to honours, or there is first year students at higher education, which includes foundation and other degrees as well. But it doesn't include, as I say, colleges. In order to compare institutions, HESA also publishes what they call benchmarks, and they're very adamant that you should not use the straightforward performance indicator, the percentages you get of numbers, because of the variation between institutions. So benchmarks are produced for each institution in the UK that have students under 21. And they are based on what's called sector averages of similar institutions. They take into account the subject mix and entry-level qualifications at an institution. And a low benchmark equals a selective institution, a higher tariff institution. And for the purpose of what we were doing, we referred to what we call the low benchmark institutions as higher tariff to fit in with the rest of the report. And a high benchmark institution is a less selective institution with a lower tariff requirement. And as already mentioned, the tariff is around the number of points you gain from the qualifications you've had. So it's a numerical value given to qualifications, for example, Highers and A-levels that a person holds. And the higher the level, the better the grades, the higher the tariff score. So you can see how that is created. And you can also see how it links into the issues that Lucy was raising around the fact that students coming with a lower tariff from school are going to have more problems getting into the more selective institutions. So in order to make the comparison, our focus was on Scottish institutions compared to the rest of the UK. And we used HESA widening participation table 1B, which anyone can check out on because it's publicly accessible online. And we selected Scottish institutions with benchmarks at 31% or below. And this is actually below the UK average because we were wanting to capture the more selective institutions there. And that was of students with the NSEC 4 to 7. We did do a similar analysis using the state school, but what we're focused on is the NSEC 4 to 7. And those institutions that had the benchmark below 31, Scottish ones, were described as higher tariff institutions. We then took the other institutions in the UK, in England, in Northern Ireland, and in Wales, and grouped them according to that criteria. So the remaining institutions in each of the countries were described as lower tariff institutions. So first of all, just to show you, and again, this is reiterating the point made by Lucy, is that the number of higher institutions in each country, in Scotland, there were 8 out of 18. In other words, nearly half. So about 44%, I think it comes out at. In England, 39 out of 123, and that's roughly 32, a third of the institutions. So much lower proportion. I hesitate to put in percentages here because we've got such small numbers. So in Wales, 1 out of 8 is a higher tariff, and in Northern Ireland, 1 out of 4. And the findings was that a higher proportion of higher tariff institutions in the Scottish section than in the rest of the UK, especially in Wales. And there's also, which I'll show you in the next slide, a higher proportion of NSEC 4 to 7 students, so more NSEC 4 to 7 working class students actually get into the higher tariff institutions in Scotland than in England. But there's a lower proportion that get into the lower tariff institution than in England. So you can see that the system caters slightly differently for the NSEC 4 to 7 groups. And equally, the Welsh is pretty similar to Scotland, actually, as is Northern Ireland is higher. I mean, there are some interesting issues, I think, around Northern Ireland, which we haven't touched upon, which is to do with the level of professional occupations in the total population, which might impact on that. But I won't go into that here. But however, if we now focus on, we've already identified that there's nearly half of the institutions in Scotland are higher tariff. If we focus on the 4 most selective institutions in Scotland, then the difference between England and the more selective Russell Group institutions in England, the difference disappears. So it's more or less the same In fact, it is the same proportion from NSEC 4 to 7 in Scotland and England, but it's much higher in Wales, and it's even higher in Northern Ireland. And we did a similar calculation using the Sutton Trust 30, which is again the Sutton Trust 30 in the rest of the UK compared to the Scottish elite institutions, which is a slightly different grouping, not much difference from the Russell Group. And again, we find very little, marginally more, 21% as opposed to 20% in England, but much higher in Wales and particularly Northern Ireland. So just to summarise at this point, there's a higher proportion of NSEC 4 to 7 students in higher tariff, more selective institution in Scotland than in England, but a lower proportion in lower tariff than in England. There's no or virtually no difference between Scottish ancient institutions and the English Russell Group or ST Group's institutions, the most selective institution in the proportion of NSEC 4 to 7 students. In Wales and Northern Ireland, the proportion is higher. So the question then arises is, which of the higher tariff institutions are accounting for this overall higher proportion? And if we look now at the Scottish institutions that were in the group of higher tariff, we have kept the Glasgow School of Art, which we omitted out of some of the calculations because it's very specialist, but it's in there just now. And you can see that it's Stirling University and Strathclyde actually perform above their benchmark. So they're accounting the old universities as opposed to the ancients are the ones that are actually attracting more of the NSEC 4 to 7 students. And the one in green there, St Andrews University, is actually statistically significant below its benchmark. And that's a measure it's a very strict, statistically significant measure. So they're way below their benchmark to be statistically significant below. If we look at the NSEC 4 to 7, coming back to the performance of the most elite institutions in Scotland, and I think Lucy mentioned the fact that there has been some changes over the last few years. We can see that there have been changes, and we are suggesting that this might well be due to the ring-fence funding that was put into place to actually provide additional places specifically for students from NSEC 4 to 7 backgrounds, or I don't know whether they used NSEC 4 to 7 or I think it was SIM that was used, but you can see it coming out in the NSEC 4 to 7 figures as well, because there's obviously an overlap between them. So, and you can also see that the impact has been the greatest in the two institutions which had the lowest level before the ring-fence funding came in. And I think one of the questions is, will that funding continue? I'm not sure. I think there's been some debate about it. It was going to be discontinued. So, conclusion of the analysis using UK-wide PIs and benchmarks. There are important differences between the overall characteristics of the Scottish and English university sectors. Scotland has a greater proportion of higher tariff or more academically selective institution. England has a higher proportion of lower tariff or less selective institutions. So, as already mentioned, therefore the profile of the Scottish university sector is likely to work against the inclusion of students from less advantaged backgrounds in comparison to other parts of the UK, because there are fewer lower tariff universities which can offer opportunities to those with lower grades who don't get into the higher tariff institutions. And ring-fenced funding seems to have had an impact, especially on the two institutions with the lowest proportion of NSEC 4 to 7 students initially. So finally, the question was, which was on about this part of it, how socially inclusive are selective in the universities in Scotland and England? I think we can say probably not very. I would like to just add a couple of things, because I think we've been talking about data here and issues around what data we have. And there is a sense that we're focusing very much on young, under 21 students who are going to university more or less straight from school, or whether they're taking a college route. So mature full-time students, a slightly higher proportion using the Polar 3, are slightly more likely to come from lower participation neighbourhoods. Part-time students, which there are very few of, but also more likely to come from lower participation neighbourhoods. Gender disability and subject study is not included when we're looking at widening access, and I've been particularly interested in the looking at disability and widening access and how the two interact. Retention outcomes and entry to the labour market, which again Lucy has mentioned that the opportunities are not so great. And the other one I think is an issue. We do tend to compare England, which is very large as a sector, with the other much smaller jurisdictions in the UK who have much smaller sectors. And there are important differences between the southeast of England, who have actually lower participation rates if you use it NSEC than Scotland, compared to the northeast. I think northeast is particularly northwest. So I think perhaps that's something we need to look at as well, because if we're thinking about a policy as being applied within a country such as England, then if there are differences there, what can that tell us in terms of widening participation? And what could it tell us about whether it is a market economy as well? Because there are tensions between people who comment on whether England has a full market economy or not. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So we'll have the same again. If we could take maybe 3 questions, which Elizabeth can answer now, and then we can obviously discuss these points further at the end. And if you could say who you are and where you're from when the mic comes to you. So one here. One here, sorry. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Ruth Mendel from the Scottish Council of Independent Schools, so you probably won't be too surprised by my question. You didn't touch on it so much in this, but in the larger report there is more about students that have been to local authority schools and independent schools. And I just wondered if you had any comments in terms of the expansion of means-tested bursaries within the sector. Just going to get the figure to hand. It's now 3.2% of senior school pupils are on full 100% bursaries. So those are pupils that wouldn't otherwise be able to attend those schools. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts or comments in the light of that on how effective an indicator that is.
Okay, that's the first one, second one here, and third one at the back. So one here.
Anne Packard, I'm concerned, I think, that you don't always have the data that would help you to provide a better evidence base, and that might go for what Lucy said as well. And given the proportion of national budget spent on education and its long-term importance to the future of the UK, what pressure can be brought on all the jurisdictions to produce an adequacy and consistency of data which helps you better to do your research?
And gentleman towards the back there.
Thank you. Neil McLennan from the Cabinet Office. I was quite interested in your conclusion that you're suggesting almost that Scotland is doing quite well in terms of the high tariff institutions and how it's been able to attract students from widening access backgrounds. But it just struck me, given that Scotland has 18 universities compared to England having 123, then per capita wise we're over-provided, or we've got more universities in Scotland than in England. So does that have to be taken into account in terms of drawing comparisons? And also you seem to be comparing 50% of the universities in Scotland which you've classed as high tariff, compared to around a third in England. So again, I just wondered if there's over-provision, then it seems to me that a conclusion from that would be that we were doing relatively better. So I just wondered if those two statistics were taken into account.
Okay, Elizabeth.
Yeah. The first one, in terms of the independent sector, I think there will be, I will start by saying I think there will be a little bit more about independent schools in the next presentation, I think, that Sheila is doing. And the second point is that the state school indicator as used is under question, as I mentioned. And because there is so much variation between state schools, it's not seen as a particularly useful indicator. Having said that, I think it's concerning that a relatively small proportion of the population go to independent schools, and that goes for England as well. I think it's about 7%. And when you look at the proportion of students that get into, for example, Cambridge and Oxford, and it hasn't shifted at all, a huge proportion, I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, actually, sorry?
It's around 40%.
Yeah, that's right. I was hesitating to say that, who get from independent schools and thinking about the impact that then has on students from state schools. So I take your point that independent state school is not a particularly useful indicator, and it needs more fine-grained, and I think that's what's going to come out of the new PIs. Adequacy of data, I think, was the second one. I think this is something that we've been going on about for ages, and I'm looking at Linda Croxford here, because Linda has put in, and I think we put into to the Widening Commission access when they were asking for evidence. We were actually saying that we need far better data. But the thing that I particularly been going on about is I think we need better data which would address the sort of longitudinal issue of actually tracking through from school up into university, which I'm not sure how feasible it is to do that in England. I know that they're far further ahead in terms of being able to track pupils out of school, but I don't know how well it kind of then, how easy it is to keep tab on students. But I would agree with you, and we've been banging on about it. We've been actually asking for it, and not just that, but also effective data linkage. So, now
Maybe it's a question for the Taxpayers Alliance.
Well, I think some of these things, the more effective data doesn't have to cost an awful lot of money, because I think that there are ways, certainly of tracking, not all groups of students, but certainly Scottish domiciled students who've gone through the Scottish system, which is a large proportion of the students you could track through from school by, for example, examination numbers and things. So there are ways of doing it. And I'm interested, actually, because I've been doing some work comparing Sweden and the UK in relation to particularly widening access and disabled students. And Sweden doesn't publish any of this data, but they have the most sophisticated data linkage system in the world, I think. So it's a matter of wanting to do it, as opposed to, at times, I think, as opposed to, having to pour masses of money into it. And I think the third question was about, do we have too many institutions in Scotland, am I right? Or too, or are we...
I just wondered if that would help to explain why we appear to be doing relatively better.
Yes. Yeah, because those that get into the higher tariff institutions, clear there's a higher proportion, but they're not getting into the elite institutions. And those that don't get in, it's obviously the college route, which, as Lucy has shown, is excellent in many ways, but it actually adds years on to what you're doing rather than going straight into university. So it might be that the cap on numbers that we have in Scotland, which has been lifted in England, is actually restricting access for the most disadvantaged. And I think that's something that certainly Christina Iannelli was looking at a few years ago, saying that the social mobility tends to occur at times when the system expands. So you had that in the 1990s, for example.
Lucy,
Yeah. Yes.
High tariffs. Elsewhere in the report, I didn't show it. There's a graph where I compared the number going into what you might call Russell Group Sutton Trust and high-low tariff. And absolutely, thank you. What you find is in Scotland, just because so much more of our provision is in a box marked higher tariff, institutions that in England wouldn't be higher tariff, places like Stirling or Strathclyde probably wouldn't count in England. With those kind of profiles of course and intake, but because our entry bar is higher, it pushes more institutions into the higher tariff group. So if you compare higher tariff England and Scotland, you're not really comparing like with like type institutions. That's why it's the benchmarks are interesting, because they bring out that list of, say, was it 39 out of 120 something in England versus 8 in Scotland. So it's important. It's a very strong sign of quite how much harder or how much higher the entrance bar is for the Scottish system, and how that high bar, which in England you tend to find concentrated in a smaller number of institutions, is applied across a larger range of our institutions. I think that's probably the summary. Sheila, do you think that's a key point here?
I just wanted to make a point about the supply of places, because I think one of the main points we want to make from this report is that there's actually an undersupply of places for Scottish students who want to go into university. Lucy was saying, first of all, that there is a lower entry rate. Students in Scotland have a lower success rate when they apply to university than students in England. It's much harder to get into university in Scotland because of an undersupply. And of course, a cross-border flow issue is partly to blame here. Susan has done work, Susan Whittaker, who's here, has been doing her PhD on cross-border student flows, but Scotland imports a high proportion of students from across the border, and it has a high proportion of international students. Students who cross borders are by and large very socially privileged. At Edinburgh and St Andrews, for example, a third of undergraduates come from the rest of the UK, and St Andrews has a third of its undergraduates who are international. Very, very privileged group. So actually, it's the opposite point, I think. We've got an undersupply of places in Scotland, not an oversupply.
Thank you, Sheila. And I think the one point for us that came out that was very interesting was the way in which these dedicated places that there have been in recent years seem to have had a material impact, probably more of a material impact actually on a number of elite Scottish universities than anything comparable I can think of in England. So it's really important that those dedicated places are preserved and that they remain ring-fenced for that purpose through to the future. So we're going to turn now back to Sheila. Thank you, Elizabeth. And she's going to look at the changing nature of university social profiles over time and how they're affected by the choice of students from socially advantaged backgrounds.
Right, Grace, just before you go, can you show me how to work the this pointer here? Which is it? Okay. And if I want the laser pointer, okay, fine. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Is it working, the mic? Yeah, okay. So I'm actually stepping into the shoes of Gittit, who did this part of the analysis. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today. And I want to say that at least the first part of the presentation draws very heavily on work that has been done already by Linda Croxford, who's here in the room, and our late colleague David Rafe, who we miss a very great deal. So one of the interesting points, when the binary line was removed between polytechnics, or the former central institutions in Scotland, and universities, was whether we were going to find choice of university based much more on subject or reputation for teaching, so that we were going to see a kind of erosion of traditional boundaries between universities. So there was quite a lot of work in the academic literature about whether the traditional hierarchies of universities would remain or whether they would gradually be eroded by student choice.
And I think the answer, as we're going to see from section 5 of the report, is that really this hasn't happened. Now, of course, as we've seen throughout the morning, making comparisons across different systems is always difficult. That's absolutely not a reason for not doing it. All international research is challenging. Even making comparisons across the UK is challenging because of the different characteristics of the system. But people really want to know how the different systems compare, and that's the main reason for doing it. So, Rafe and Croxford's institutional classification identifies 3 types of Scottish universities according to their level of selectivity, research and teaching profile and historical origins: ancient universities, other pre-92 universities and post-92 universities. By way of contrast, they distinguish between 4 types of English universities, what they called the Golden Triangle universities, 3 of them, the most selective in England. And the reason for having 3 there was because UCAS will not let you pick out 2. It's a rule of 3. You've got to have 3 in the group. But anyway, no prizes for guessing which these might possibly be. Other Russell Group universities, other pre-92 universities and post-92 universities. And I'm going to make a few points before just moving on to the graph which shows this. So the majority of the students in Scottish ancient universities are from professional managerial backgrounds. 68% in 1996, 59% in 2014. Their proportion is actually lower because they do make up a smaller proportion of the university population. There has been expansion and therefore they're now a smaller group. By way of contrast, those from professional managerial groups make up 50% of the post-92 university student population in 1996 and 42% of this group in 2014. So, as you will see from the figure, there has been a lower proportion of people from professional managerial backgrounds in the most selective universities, but the decline in the post-92 has been the same or even greater. So it's not like people are now choosing, middle-class students are choosing to go to the post-92 group. That isn't the case. There's an 18 percentage point difference in the proportion of middle-class students in ancient as opposed to post-92 universities, and this hasn't changed over time. So the hierarchies of the universities in Scotland have remained absolutely the same. We see the contrast even more starkly when we look at the proportion of students from independent schools in ancient Scottish universities. Now, I actually think the distinction between private and state schools is very important, and I would be very disappointed if data are not continuing to be gathered in this regard. We have to remember that to go to a private school, the majority of parents are paying at least £12,000 a year out of, we hope, taxed income, so that you would have to earn about £20,000 in order to send 1 child a year to a private school. We're not talking about boarding schools here, but just ordinary day schools. So if you've got 2 kids going through the system, it's going to cost you at least £40,000 a year. You know, that's the amount of money you would have to earn to pay for that. And of course, we must remember that the median wage in the UK is £26,000 a year. So I think it is actually extremely important that we bear in mind that even though state schools vary quite greatly in terms of their social composition, every single comprehensive school in Scotland has a range of groups. There are no state schools in Scotland who do not have a significant proportion of children from quite poor backgrounds. And we must also remember that people who go to independent schools are selected not only generally on parents' ability to pay, but also on academic grounds, so that there's a dual selection process going on here. And in fact, many disabled pupils, children with learning difficulties, don't get into independent schools, and many children who have difficulties in the schools, the independent schools, are removed quite rapidly. So there is a big difference in the system, and I think that's true both in England and Scotland, and it is reflected, as Sutton Trust reports have shown, in social hierarchies that run through the echelons of power in both Scotland and England. We should remember as well that independent schools are educating about 5% of the Scottish school population and about 7% of the English school population. We find very similar distinctions in England when we look at the preference of middle class students to go to the most selective universities. And just to show you these figures here, the first 3 lines are looking at people from professional managerial backgrounds as a proportion of the university population in ancient universities. And you can see that we have this measure over time from 1996 onwards, thanks to the work of Linda and David. So you can see that there has been a dip in their proportion towards 2012-14 in the pre- and post-92 sectors in Scotland, less of a dip in the ancient universities. When we look the bottom 3 lines at what's going on in relation to the proportion of people from independent schools in ancient pre-92 and post-92, we find that in 2014, the proportion of the population in Scottish ancient universities drawn from independent schools is actually going up. So despite all the widening access efforts that have been going on, we see that there is an increasing proportion, and indeed, they are grossly overrepresented, more than 25%, about 25%, from independent schools that are catering for 5% of the Scottish school population. So I don't think that this is something that we should disregard. I think this is something that is actually very important. And you will see that as a proportion of the pre-92 and post-92, there is far less disproportionality there in professional managerial backgrounds and indeed in independent school backgrounds. People from independent schools, as a proportion of these university profiles, they are not increasing in the post-92 sector in Scotland. There's been a little bit of a decrease over recent years in their proportion within those populations. And I'll come back to this point in a minute when we're looking at where entrants from different types of school actually go. So when we look at the English data, we see broadly the same patterns in terms of the proportion of people from professional managerial backgrounds in different types of university. So obviously you can see very clearly there that in the golden triangle, the top line, it's been broadly steady. In the bottom line there, the post-92 in the professional managerial, the proportion of professional managerial in post-92 universities has again been broadly steady, but it's the gap that is interesting. The gap is almost exactly the same, that people from professional managerial backgrounds are making up a very similar proportion of people in the more selective universities and are not changing their preferences. They're not thinking, well, the teaching at such and such a university is better, therefore I will go there, even though it's a post-92 university. When we look at the Russell Group, Golden Triangle, Russell Group, pre-92 and post-92, the proportion of the population drawn from the private school sector, we again find quite major overrepresentation, because even though England has a higher proportion of students in independent schools, it's still only about 7% of the total school population. So they're making up about 42% of the population of the Golden Triangle universities, which is just obviously very, very disproportionate with regard to their overall percentage. And you can see that there has been, over time, a slight decline in their representation in the post-92 university population. So I think that those figures are interesting and important. The figures that I've been showing you so far are looking at the composition of the different types of universities. Now what I'm going to be looking at is the percentage of students from state and private school who are making choices, who are entering particular types of universities. So it's just a different way of cutting the data. So in Scottish institutions, students from independent schools are much more likely to gain a place in an older university compared with state school entrants. And what we find is that the disparity between private school students and state school students has actually been increasing over time, despite the widening access efforts. So this is true in both England and Scotland, but in Scotland it's really quite stark. So this shows data from 2011-12 to 2014-15. Just to look at 2014-15 first, you will see that nearly 3/4, 71%, of entrants from independent schools are going to ancient universities. And that compares with only 29% of state school entrants. If you go back to 2011-12, you can see that the discrepancy between private schools and state schools in Scotland has become more marked. So in 2011-12, 62% of private school entrants were going to ancient universities, compared with 27% of state school entrants. So these figures really belie the effectiveness, as I've said already, of all the work that has been going on to try to push things in the other direction. If anything, the trend has been going in absolutely the wrong direction. And I think we have to understand this in terms of what's happening, in terms of the marketisation of the Scottish university system. It's very interesting that politicians often refer to the marketisation of the English system. But I think in terms of competition between different sectors for entry, we have just as much of a market in Scotland as in England. Middle class insecurity, I think, is driving quite a lot of this. People are very well aware of the advantages of going to particular universities in terms of status, in terms of your chances of getting a professional job, and people are making quite hard calculations. If parents have invested £12,000 or £24,000 a year, depending on how many children they have going through private school, they then want to make sure that they maximise that investment by getting their child into the most privileged university that they possibly can. And we shouldn't really be surprised by that. Everybody is worried about getting a proper job when they leave university. It's just that in this competition, people who are already very privileged are doing massively better and increasingly better. Social reproduction is happening at a pace here over time. And I think these types of figures are ones that are actually not often spoken about in Scotland. I mean, certainly in terms of entry to law, medicine, and indeed teaching now, you need to go to an ancient university. I mean, if we think about the entry of the colleges, the undergraduate teacher training into UCAS and into universities, you know, the merger of the colleges with the universities, all of that virtually, apart from a bit of University of Western Scotland, has gone into older universities, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, Strathclyde, Stirling. So again, even a profession like teaching, which has traditionally been a route of social mobility, particularly for women from working class backgrounds, is now increasingly related to coming from a higher and more privileged social class background. When we look at England, the average percentage of under 21s from state and private schools entering HE, we do find I would say, a broadly similar background, although the contrast, if anything, is even starker. So here we see that 48%, nearly half, of private school entrants in England go to Russell Group universities. But we must remember that that compares with 62% in 2011-12, but 2014-15 we saw 71%. So, in fact, students from independent schools, some of which, of course, will have come from the rest of the UK, but the majority will be from Scottish independent schools, are having even more of an advantage than their English private school counterparts in terms of access to the most selective universities. So again, this is a bit of Scotland that is not often talked about, the social hierarchies associated with independent schools. We also see, though, a slightly higher proportion in the post-92. But again, the contrast between the private school and the state school are very marked. It is interesting that in 2014-15 in England, 20% of entrants from private schools went to post-92 universities. When you look at Scotland, you find that only 10% went to post-92 universities. So again, it's not just the division at the top end, it's also the distinction at the post-92 end. People from private schools, generally in Scotland, don't go to post-92 universities. They're twice as likely to in England. Right, well, I think I've made the main points I want to make here. But really, in summary, the proportion of students from higher social class groups is greater in older, more selective universities than in newer, less selective universities. That's true in Scotland and England. And the gap has not narrowed between 1996 and 2014. So the idea that students in the future would be making choices based on teaching quality or particular courses or so on, really hasn't materialised, except that people are going for very traditional and safe options. And I don't think we should be totally surprised about this, given the amount of financial insecurity that people are living with at the moment. So I'm going to pause at that point. There are some additional points in the slide, but I don't want to reiterate.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. So maybe if we take 3 questions on what you've just spoken about now before, because you're going to talk about policy in a moment. So can we have 3 questions for Sheila? I've got one gentleman there, I've got somebody at the back there, and gentleman over here.
Yes, thank you. Roger Mercer. My experience in the university is that private students are very prominent, but it was your line which said some of those will be from England, of course, but the majority from Scotland. Do you have evidence for that?
Yes.
Yes, I see, right. There's good evidence.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, my impression is that there are many more from England than from Scotland.
Well, if you were to look, I mean, numerically, the majority of students in Scottish universities are Scottish domiciled. If you are to look at the proportion of the populations of the much smaller number from England and the much bigger number from Scotland, we would find that a higher proportion of the smaller number from England are from independent schools. But they will be a minority in the total university population. And I'm looking vaguely over in Susan's direction, who's examined the data in a great deal of detail for her PhD, which she's just completing, and she is nodding. Do you want to add anything, Susan, to that?
Right, yes, there are fewer English students, but they are more likely to be from independent schools. So half of the students who come to Edinburgh University went to a private school, from England, went to a private school, and about more like a third, I think, from Scotland. So.
And I think it's worth making the point as well that the efforts of the SFC and the Scottish Government are all related to the Scottish domicile population. And yet the proportion of English students, the English student population who moves to Scotland, principally to St Andrews, Edinburgh, and to a lesser extent Glasgow, are from very privileged background, which has an effect on the total culture of the university. And again, I am not lambasting universities for doing this. I think we can understand that universities find students from more socially privileged backgrounds attractive active customers. They don't have well, they pay fees, but they're also very anxious to recruit independent school students from Scotland as well, who are not paying fees. But these students are easy to teach, they have massive family support, so the universities do recruit them, and they also mainly, and this is the main reason, come in with very high grades.
Okay, so we've got one at the back there.
Hi, Alan McLachlan, Edinburgh Napier University. It was really just a question around, you mentioned the gap and about student choices based on class, but actually how much of those choices are dictated by the attainment gap from the achievement? Because clearly there's an achievement gap that is evidenced between the social classes, which ultimately go on to influence the range of courses and institutions that are open to those particular students, rather than making a decision just because I'm working class, so therefore I'm not going to apply to an ancient institution. I think there's obviously clearly a bigger link, a bigger causal effect with the attainment levels.
Yeah, and I'm coming on to that in the next bit that I'm going to be presenting. But yes, the main reason why students from poorer backgrounds and from state schools are less well represented in the more selective universities is because they have lower levels of educational attainment. And that is the nub of the problem. And all the tinkering around with widening access initiatives and so far with contextualised admissions, these efforts make marginal changes, but they cannot possibly compensate for the degree of difference in educational attainment between social class groups.
Thank you. And we have one last question for this session.
Hello, Chris Playford, Edinburgh University. I think everybody's just nicked all the points I was about to make, but on the same sort of theme, I wondered if you're able to take account of the UCAS tariffs involved, and because I suspect there may be, because of more students and higher attainment over time, I'm suspecting that some of those barriers or the boundaries will have been rising in some of those elite institutions.
Yes, I mean, that is the reason why we are seeing a higher proportion of people from independent schools and a failure to erode the likelihood of people from professional managerial backgrounds to go to different types of university. These students are doing better in the system. I mean, in the past, 20, 40, 50 years ago, society was far less driven by attainment. You could do well in business if you didn't have necessarily a university degree. And this was particularly true for girls, actually, who were going to get married. I mean, now things are driven much more by credentials. And so the advantages that you accrue by being educated in particular social contexts become greater over time.
Okay, thank you. So I think, Sheila, you're now going to just say a bit about policy levers.
Yes.
And their importance in this area.
Yeah. Grace, I wonder if you can help me to find it. I'll just grab a bit of water as well. Thank you very much. Right, now, Jim, in a minute, is going to be talking about some of the big messages. So I'm hoping that I'm not nicking too many of your lines here, but you'll say it much better than me anyway. So I shall go through this fairly quickly. In Scotland, there has been a kind of orthodoxy that free undergraduate tuition is going to solve all of our widening access problems. The mantra of politicians has been that access to higher education is based in Scotland on the ability to learn rather than the ability to pay, as opposed to England, where presumably it's based on the ability to pay rather than the ability to learn. There is a tendency to misrepresent the way in which the system in Scotland of income contingent loans actually operates. But clearly, Scotland has at least, if not a much greater problem, with fair representation of different groups in its universities. And one of the things, of course, is that the policy in Scotland has been literally, at Heriot-Watt University, carved in tablets of stone. It's become incredibly difficult to actually question what this policy is actually achieving without being branded as some sort of regressive Neolithic person who is standing for the worst aspects of the marketised system. However, I do think that is a problem if you stick to the line that in Scotland university access is based on the ability to learn rather than the ability to pay, because then you would be saying that people from poorer backgrounds have less of an ability to learn, which I think would be highly problematic. So how effective then has free undergraduate tuition been as a way of widening access to university? Well, I don't want to go through this because this is really making the points that have already been made. So Scotland has a lower proportion of 18-year-olds going straight from school to university, 23%, compared with Wales, 26%, England, 30%, and Northern Ireland. 18-year-olds from the richest neighbourhood in Scotland are 4 times as likely to go straight from school to university as those from the poorest neighbourhoods, compared with 2.4 times as likely in Scotland. The abolition of the graduate endowment in 2007 and the previous changes in fees regimes made absolutely no difference to the application, acceptance and entry rates of Scottish 18-year-olds compared with observable patterns in other countries. So it's quite interesting that people, I think, in Scotland have been led to believe that free undergraduate tuition is producing a fairer system. But in fact, as we've seen, it's actually a much greater benefit to middle-class people who are much more likely to go to university in the first place. It's also, of course, a very expensive policy. Scotland has 4-year honours degrees compared with 3 years typically in the rest of the UK. And it has meant that places in Scotland have been capped. So in England, as of 2013 onwards, there has been a progressive uncapping of places in university. And from 2016 onwards, they are completely uncapped. We know from the work of Christina Iannelli that you are much more likely to get more students from poorer backgrounds drawn into higher education when the system is expanding. So you could say that the system in England, as opposed to the system in Scotland, has been set up in this way to be more inclusive. It is able to draw in more students from poorer backgrounds because there are simply more places available. It's keeping pace with rising demand through the school system, whereas the system in Scotland, as we've seen from Lucy's presentation, is not keeping pace. Lucy has talked already about the pros and cons of the college sector and the fact that in Scotland, 90% of increased participation by those from the poorest background is in colleges, doing sub-degree programmes. Now again, this is presented in Scotland as being an unalloyed good, and certainly all of us would want to say that many students benefit from going to college and then on to university. But we must remember that there are many downsides as well. Between 40 and 50%, we don't have the exact proportion, actually go on to finish off a degree. Those who do, if they want to go to an older university, have often to take 6 years to do an honours degree, compared with 3 years that they would take in England. It may, of course, offer a friendlier environment, but there again, HNCs and HNDs in colleges are often based on demonstrating practical vocational skills. So they often don't lead very smoothly into the final years of a university degree. And if you think how difficult it is for a middle-class kid to go to the first year of university, to make friends, to get into that sort of social setting, we're actually making it much more difficult for people from poorer backgrounds who are suddenly parachuted into a university setting with actually very often very little form of social support. So those who are in the least socially advantaged situation are being faced with the hardest type of transition. And of course we shouldn't forget that college is much cheaper for government. And in relation to social fairness, we should be suspicious when a much cheaper form of higher education is being disproportionately reserved for those from poorer backgrounds. So I've already made these points. I've also made the points about entry to professions, which is very, very important. Increasingly, you have to go to an older university in Scotland to get access not just to law and medicine, but to teaching as well. Scottish Government doesn't have data on lifetime earnings of those with HN rather than degree level qualifications. This is clearly something that we do need. But BIS research shows that even though you're more likely to be in a job if you've got an HNC or HND, you are likely to earn significantly less over a lifetime. And of course, college students are likely to be taught by people with lower qualifications and who don't do research compared with people who are being taught by university staff. In fact, you don't need to have a degree to teach in college, we should remember. Regulation of widening access. We have seen that in both England and Scotland, there has been an extension of the regulatory net. In fact, it happened 10 years earlier in England with the establishment of the Office for Fair Access. But the SFC has been increasingly regulating widening access through widening access outcome agreements and so on. So we have to ask, how effective has this been? Well, what I'm saying now is based on an analysis that we did for University of Scotland of the first round of access outcome agreements, and the second round also. This work was funded by the Sutton Trust. And what we've actually found is that universities are committed, of course, to widening access. The ancient universities do a lot of work in this area, as do the post-92s. The documents, though, are often producer-captured, you might say, and we shouldn't be surprised here. They present the universities in the very best possible light. They're all meant to make mention of SIMD 20 to 40 students. The universities who are not doing very well in this regard skate swiftly over this and move on to the other areas where they're doing a lot better. And it is quite stark, actually, when you look at how the ancient Scottish universities are doing in relation to recruiting people from SIMD 20 neighbourhoods. I think in Aberdeen, the proportion of people from SIMD 20 is 3.6%. It's incredibly low. Glasgow is the highest, but those students, that will be just over 10% at Glasgow. So really, these figures are not very good. But all of the access outcome agreements are written in completely different styles. It would be impossible for a student to look at these documents and be able to make comparisons. And that's true for the wider public as well. So they're not documents that are focused on the needs and interests of the public. They are much more, I would say, self-justification documents of the university sector. And I don't want to dismiss what universities are doing. Coming to school attainment, it is absolutely the case that the most significant reason for the lower proportion of people from poorer backgrounds is to do with what people attain in school. So you can see from the figure below how strongly associated school attainment is with social class background. This is looking at the pupils achieving 3 or more A's at higher in one sitting by SIMD quintile for 2011. So you can see that the poorest 20%, only 2.5% of people in that group are getting 3 or more A's in highers at one sitting. It goes up to 17.4% in the richest 20%. So that is indeed a very stark contrast. Jill Wyness actually extracted, my colleague at the London School of Economics, extracted the figures for Dundee City. She was particularly interested in this as somebody who grew up in a poor part of the city. And she found that in the poorest 20% of neighbourhoods, of Scottish neighbourhoods all in Dundee, only 5 pupils got 3 or more hires in one sitting. So you can see how, if you were looking at it from the university's point of view, you would say, well, it's almost impossible to have equal proportional representation when we have such stark contrasts at school level. Now, the Scottish Government has said that by 2030, 20% of people from each of these quintiles will be going to university. And I assume it's meaning all types of university. So I think that just gives you a sense of what a steep course this is actually going to be. And it will be hopeful that we actually remember the promises that have been made when this date actually comes around. University fees have implications for tackling educational disadvantage because I think that major resource redistribution would be needed across the whole of the education sector in Scotland. Free tuition policy means that universities capture the lion's share of the education budget. So in 2012-13, £1 billion was allocated to university teaching. That compares with 300 million allocated to colleges, 450 million to preschool. And of course, we must remember there that colleges, of course, are educating a much poorer group of students who have much, much higher learning needs. School funding over this period actually fell by 5%, with reductions in the teaching force and in classroom assistants who are helping students with learning difficulties. Only about 5% of LA funding has traditionally been targeted at pupils experiencing social disadvantage. Now, of course, the Scottish Government has its improvement strategy, which is wanting to make a difference here. But again, the amount of resource that might be needed to make a difference is probably not happening at the moment. And it was quite interesting. The BBC did a little poll of people just before the last Holyrood elections, and it was looking at people's favoured policies, whether they thought that free university tuition was more important or redistribution to students in poorer areas. And they were asked to rate these things on a scale up to 10. And I think that free university tuition scored about 8, whereas redistributing funding to poorer areas got about 5, which tells you something about public priorities in Scotland. The targeted places for students from disadvantaged backgrounds certainly have made a difference. We know that from 2014 onwards, SFC allocated 727 undergraduate places, widening access to the most selective universities. It was quite interesting that these places were taken up differently, shall we say, by the different universities. Glasgow took up by far the most. I think St Andrews probably took up the fewest. And however, these places have certainly made a difference. The future of this policy is quite uncertain at the moment. It was initially funded by additional money from the Scottish Government. Now, the Scottish Government then said it was rescinding the additional money, and the SFC is now going to make up the funding from its existing pots. We also should remember, though, that the measure that's being used here is, of course, SIMD 20, and we need to remember that about 50% of poor students, people from poorer backgrounds, are not living in SIMD 20 neighbourhoods. So the danger is, if you target all the additional resourcing on SIMD 20 students, poor students everywhere else in Scotland are likely to get a particularly problematic hit. One of the things that has been actually important in terms of the increasing proportions of students from poorer backgrounds in ancient universities have been changes like the inclusion, administrative changes, changes in UTT undergraduate teacher training, which from 2015 onwards went through UCAS, and those students are more likely to come from less advantaged backgrounds, and those students have made a difference. Now, it hasn't actually made a difference. It is an administrative change, but that in itself, I think, is quite interesting. So the future. The Scottish Government cap on university places means that there's a gap between increasing demand and relatively static supply, and that is really the nub of the problem, if you like. It also restricts the policy, which is hugely expensive, restricts funding available to improving the attainment of pupils in poorer areas. And of course, I must drop this point in as well. There are quite a number of us who are concerned about the impact of curriculum for excellence in this regard. The Russell Group of Universities publishes its list of facilitating subjects, which are broadly things like science, English, maths, language, and so on. Curriculum for excellence places great store on pupils doing appropriate subjects. Now, of course, there is a big worry in that students from poorer areas are going to be channeled into vocational courses at an earlier age, are going to emerge with fewer of the facilitating subject qualifications, and are therefore going to have an even harder task in the future to get into the more selective universities. So we have to be very careful, and no research is being funded in this area at all, actually. So this is a major source of concern. So widening access flourishes when systems are expanding, and this remains the central challenge because of the capping of the numbers in Scotland. Right, I shall stop there.
Thank you, Sheila. Now, Professor Jim Gallagher has been listening patiently to the discussion so far and is going to give us the benefit of his wisdom, and I know he has a lot of experience in this area in Scotland.
Well, thank you very much. I feel I have literally got the graveyard spot here, not merely keeping you all from lunch, but also coming in after all these extremely detailed presentations. And as Sheila said a few minutes ago, it's slightly challenging to say something that is different now from what everything has been said before. But I've spent quite a lot of time over the last little while looking at the report that's been done, so I've kind of put together some ideas and tried to pull together some of the threads, which I hope might be of some help to you. What I want to say first of all is I do think this is a really quite an outstanding piece of work. I think in terms of the careful analysis of data which has been done here, it does provide a real kind of evidence base to underpin policy. And I think both the Sutton Trust for funding this work and the team from CREID should be given enormous credit for what's been done here. I think it's a major contribution to our thinking with these issues. I think it's also good timing that it comes just after the funding of the publication of the final report from the Widening Access Commission, because this is a time when we should be in Scotland really trying to think in a very careful way about how we take these issues forward. I think it provides an important contribution to the policy debate. I'm glad to see that there are quite a few people from the Scottish Government, I think maybe one or two from the Funding Council on the list. What I said is, I hope you are going to take note, I hope you're going to take it home with you to your colleagues, and I hope you're going to have really serious discussion about it. I want to focus in on two big issues, and they have been referred to quite a lot in the course of the earlier conversations. One is about the structure of the Scottish system. And I think one of the good things this report brings out is the structural dimensions of the Scottish system and the impact of funding, and then secondly something about the colleges. First thing about the structure, and the point has been made now several times by earlier speakers, but I think it is very important for us to note this, that Scotland has this proportionally higher a higher proportion of high tariff institutions, and that even the post-92 universities in Scotland are more socially selective than universities in England. And so what this creates is a situation, and it's been made, as I say, several times earlier on, is that we have a structural situation that is making it difficult for people from disadvantaged backgrounds to gain access to higher education and also to gain access to the more privileged parts of the system. So there's a deep-rooted structural problem there that I think we have to recognise. And the second thing that, again, has been made is that the funding regime we have in Scotland is actually exacerbating this problem now. We have a situation where, as the point has been made, is in a situation where the supply has not kept pace with demand. This has a disproportionate effect on the people from the most disadvantaged backgrounds who are trying to compete to gain access to this a system that is really structured in a way that is difficult for them. And the capping of the numbers, as it's been said, means that the system can't expand in the way that it's expanding in England. And altogether, these things are, in a sense, I think, creating a kind of perfect storm for us in Scotland. And it's important that we recognise that we can't sweep it aside. We have to recognise it. So what is to be done? Sorry, that was Lenin, wasn't it? What can be done? Well, the Scottish government, did recognise this and had this ring-fenced policy for more disadvantaged students. As Sheila said, the government then said they were going to take away that and said it was basically up to the Funding Council to provide it. Funding Council, as far as I understand, has said that they would continue to do it. But there is a question here. How is this going to be sustained in the longer term? You know, there's, in a situation where there is not additional money being put into the system, how do we do it? So a big problem, a big question, I think, for the Scottish Government and then indirectly for the Funding Council. The Widening Access Commission again recognised this and talked about the establishment of access thresholds for all degree subjects, and this would be then to the advantage of students from the less advantaged backgrounds, because even if they didn't achieve the high tariff scores, they could still gain access to through these access thresholds. But again, if this is going to be successful, really we will need extra funding for this. You know, one can imagine, Sheila's made the point already about middle-class parents being very concerned to protect their advantage. If they see their places being given away to apparently underqualified students, this is not going to go down well. And similarly, high-tariff universities are not going to want to see their scores going down. The Commission for Widening Access said that that Scotland should ask the people who produce league tables to reconstruct the league tables. Now, this is a pious suggestion by any possible standards. So, you know, the only way that this policy is going to be successful is if additional funding is put forward for it. And so the question is then, will the Scottish Government do it? The Commissioner for Widening Access said it was up to the Scottish Government to determine the size of the HE system, which is, of course, the right that the government has. One hopes that in making those decisions, they will recognise the implications that there are here. And I just wanted to say something briefly to, in a sense, put this into a kind of wider context. You know, to say that this is not a problem just for Scotland. Martin Troe, the American sociologist who produced the kind of classic analysis of the transition from elite to mass higher education systems, said that there would be an insatiable demand for the increase of higher education. That's a quotation there where he says, it seems to be very unlikely that any advanced society can or will be able to stabilise the numbers going on to some form of higher education at any time in the future. In a sense, what we're trying to do is we're trying to do that in Scotland just now. And really, all the international evidence shows that it can't be done. There's other work being done by people like, for example, Simon Marginson in the UCL in London, where they're developing the concept of what they call high participation systems, and basically saying throughout the world there is pressure for what they call high participation systems with higher and higher levels of participation in higher education. So we can't hold this back, really. But there's a danger that our current policies in Scotland are trying to do that. And Troe also recognised the point, again, that Sheila made, that the middle class in a situation where they feel that they are under pressure in terms of securing the most privileged positions for their own children will always find ways of doing it. And this has been also then explored in great detail by this person, Lucas, that I've referred to there, by the concept of effectively maintained inequality, where their research, as it says, that even in times of expansion, the socially and economically advantaged maintain their position by ensuring they gain access to the most prestigious sectors of higher education, while the less advantaged are more likely to gain access to the less prestigious sectors. That's even in times of expansion. We're not really in a time of expansion here. So this reinforces this point. So these are fundamental problems. what I'm saying is policy can either mitigate these policies or exacerbate the policies. What we need now in Scotland, I think, is a careful look at how we move forward with these issues. This second point that I want to make briefly is about colleges and widening access. Now, I'm not going to say anything very much about this. It's been made a point how important the college sector is and what a positive story it is. Many of you will know I have spent many years working actively in this field. So I am the very person to say how important I think it is. But also, as this report indicates, there are some downsides, some disadvantages. I won't spend any time because they've been rehearsed at considerable length earlier on. We know what the potential problems are. What I want to say is something about the underlying issues. And the underlying issue is that we've had an evolutionary process of change in Scotland. This is not planned. Initially, HNs were vocational qualifications, and they were part-time qualifications for people who are in work. Gradually, over the last really 30 years, there's been a transition, and they have now emerged as a central part of the higher education system. But there's been no proper planning associated with that. And there's been incredible ambiguity then has arisen, because many of these qualifications still are really quite vocational. I mean, if you're doing an HNC in social care, this is essentially a vocational qualification. Or if you're doing an HND in hairdressing, it's still essentially. But I mean, if you're doing an HND in business studies or computing, most of these students now go on into higher education. So we've got this kind of very confused system. And as a result of that, issues to do with the curriculum, the approach to teaching and learning and assessment have never really been properly sorted out. And so many people in the college sector are quite rightly, can be quite defensive. They say what an excellent job they do, which they do. I mean, I'm a member of the board of the City of Glasgow College. I'm a great advocate of the role of the college sector in terms of fostering students, taking them through. But we essentially have a system which, as I say, has evolved in a way that has left many of the big questions not sorted. And I think really what we have to do now is to recognise that. Now, again, the question of what we can do. What I'm saying is, I think we really need to recognise the problems and say, what are we going to do about it? The Widening Access Report, again, says that, it says that more needs to be done to ensure that all universities engage more positively in developing articulation links, and that funding council should work with universities and colleges to develop new and more flexible models of articulation. Well, as a former member of the Access and Inclusion, in fact, the chair of the Access and Inclusion Committee, and we have another one with us today, I've tried to do lots of these things over many years. It's very difficult, I can assure you. And going back to Sheila's point about regulation, various attempts to regulate are difficult. So if we're going to address these, we're going to require some really significant recognition and leadership. Interestingly, in the Commission for Widening Access, the Commissioner for Widening Access is recommended as a solution to our problems. Well, first of all, we'll have to see whether the Scottish Government appoints this person. But if they do, they're going to be a brave man or woman, I would say. I mean, the question is, what power and resources will they have? And how will they be able to influence the policies and practice of these key players? Universities, colleges, SQA, who are quite significant and can be quite defensive about their HNs, the Funding Council and the government. Now, the Commissioner is going to be an independent person who's going to develop this. Well, let's wait and see. So, what I'm saying here is, I think this report that has been produced indicates the need for serious change. It really does indicate some of the big challenges. I think that the Widening Access Report has done the same as well. So in that sense, I think we have almost a kind of moment here when things are coming together and there's a clear definition of problems and I think a clear indication of a need for change. My closing question is, will we take the opportunity?
Thank you, Jim. Right, we've got just about half an hour to sort of open it up to you. You've been listening patiently, most of you. And what I'm going to ask is that if you've got points to make, if you could keep them relatively brief just to sort of maximise the number of contributions that people can get in. If you have got specific questions for any of the people you've heard from this morning, I'll ask them to respond at the end just so we can maximise the number of contributions. So if I could have sort of points and questions, and I've got one here to start off, and if you could say who you are and where you're from, please.
I'm Lynn at Edinburgh University. I just wanted to expand a little bit on this Jim's excellent challenge about the HN problem. I've done some research in this alongside Viv Cree and Hazel Christie about students who came to Edinburgh with HNs. And I completely agree that people who are living in poverty end up spending 6 years to do a degree and then don't necessarily get any better job at the end of it. So that's a really sad thing. But in England, I've been an examiner of the 1+2 degrees where students do their first year in college and then they move seamlessly to a university system. And I think we really ought to think about something like that as a possibility, but to have two completely different systems where students are struggling to cope with different curriculum, different learning and teaching approaches, as Jim has outlined, is really doing them a big disservice.
Thank you for that point. I mean, one observation I would just make is that, I think the foundation degree model, which you have in England, does do that. And the other thing that has been developing the last few years in England is a growth in higher apprenticeships and degree apprenticeships, which is bringing the vocational much more into university. And some of the Sutton Trust research that we've done over the last year suggests that if you go on some of these higher apprenticeship programs, because you're earning while you're learning, you don't have the associated debts that you still have in England, but actually the earnings are comparable to a number of regular degree programs. So there are certainly interesting issues there. Who else would like to contribute? We've got one over there in the corner. And if I can see the next person after as well, then it'll make it easy for the mic.
Hello, Rachel O'Neill, University of Edinburgh. I've been really interested in the analysis about HNDs, and I was wondering about what other people think about SCQF level 8, because in universities, years 1 and 2 of an undergraduate degree are SCQF level 8, and so is an HND. When you look at websites of universities, including our own, Aberdeen and Stirling, they use words like, you may be able to apply, you please contact admissions. In universities like University of West of Scotland, there's a much more positive approach to articulation on the website with student testimonials, positive language. So do the older universities not understand SCQF level 8, or is it that the HND students are not being academically prepared?
Good question. Who else would like to come in? Anyone else want to come in on that particular issue or another issue? At the front here.
Jim Crowley, University of Edinburgh. There's a very interesting presentations, really useful, interesting stuff, challenging. But there's the issue of lifelong learning I'm interested in, and the invisibility of lifelong learners in the data. There were some references to this, but it does sort of like concern me that we're kind of thinking always at the 18, 19-year-olds. And the kind of articulation that occurs between, say, colleges and universities. For instance, in the University of Edinburgh, if your qualifications are 2-year-old, you're ineligible to apply to a course of study here. So that basically means that anybody who's a lifelong learner, who's decided after 4 or 5 years that they want to come back to the university here, I don't know if it applies elsewhere, would be ineligible. So, I mean, these are very sort of simple administrative kind of policies that actually sort of make it very difficult for lifelong learners, and we would not also sort of recognise that these are probably from working class backgrounds. I think that point was made. So, you know, is there any data available around lifelong learning in the university sector that can help address, only sort of in a smaller sense, but contribute to this kind of, these issues really?
Thank you. I think you would like to come back on that, would you?
I would just like to
We'll just hold off the mic there so everyone can hear you. Yep. Just tell us who you are as well.
So yes, I'm Gillian Simmons. I'm Policy and Project Manager at the University of Edinburgh in student recruitment and admissions. And I just wanted to come back on some of that because we do have policies about recent study, but then they don't preclude somebody from being able to come back into study. We have an adult returners policy for older students who've had a gap in education. We have a recognition of prior learning policy so that we can look at things other than standard qualifications. And we do recognise qualifications that are older than 3 years old, 2 or 3 years old, depending on circumstances and the different courses applied. So we do try and make sure that that those kind of situations don't arise, and there is no blanket policy.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Who else would like to come in? Got somebody just in front of you here. Just there.
Bernard Agreste, University of Edinburgh. This is more of a comparative comment. In the University of Texas, Austin, and the Florida system, and the University of California system, students in the generally 7 to top 10% of their classes are guaranteed admission to the flagship university campus. Is there some kind of framework we can implement for students from SMID 20s? So for example, the top 5-10% of students who get the most hires are enrolled automatically into the University of Edinburgh, Aberdeen, or Glasgow, whatever it might be, and then, or in some kind of bridging program to then do well for that 1 year and then place into a second year and then get a real degree rather than going into an FEC, and then potentially spending 6 years to get a degree.
No, thank you for that point. I mean, that is an interesting one, and we did do some research on those percent systems in the States, and they are sort of quite interesting. I think one of the difficulties that did emerge was that in the University of California one, for example, University of California is a very big university, and there are prestige elements to that university and less prestigious elements. And funnily enough, the numbers who are going into the less prestigious elements seem to be greater from those who are benefiting from the scheme. On the other hand, it may encourage middle-class parents to send their kids to schools that may not be doing as well. So there may be benefits to it, but it's certainly an interesting and useful point. Who else would like to come in? Lots of you who haven't commented yet. I'm sure you've got some points you want to make. Even if you've commented before, you're welcome to comment again. Right, so we've got 1, 2.
Linda Croxford, University of Edinburgh. I'm just heartened by the number of people who have mentioned the need for better data on widening access, on progress through colleges and university and so on. I have to say that this is something that I have been shouting about for the past 10, 15 years. And people tend to agree, everybody seems to agree, that we really do need better data in order to support widening access and the kinds of social justice policies that are just so dear to our hearts. But I can't understand why we can't get it done. As I say, I have written various papers to the Scottish Funding Council and others, suggesting ways that I'm quite sure it wouldn't be too difficult to do this. But I'm beginning to wonder if there's a resistance to it, simply because when painstakingly we do piece together the data, we show that Scotland is not really doing quite so well as our complacent ideas might think. Can I go for a conspiracy theory on this, please?
Right, now is there anybody from the government or the Funding Council who'd like to come back on that? Or are you all going to hide? silence, I'm afraid. Okay. Well, you'd like to make a point at the front. Just wait for the mic. Thanks.
In many ways, Scotland is the envy of the world in terms of having the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework, the whole design of a system where progression routes could and should be available to bring people up through the system. And yet today's report and other recent research have shown that although the design is there, the implementation of that has not been successful. Why do you think, from many points of view, we haven't been able to take advantage of what seems to be Scotland's unique advantage?
Okay, I'm going to leave that question hanging for the end, if I may, and just if there are some other observations and points. So we've got two here, so make it easy for you there.
Jim asked the question, will the opportunity be taken? I will reply with a different question, which is, can we afford not to take it?
Okay, short and to the point.
Aye. So Alan Hosey, I'm a community worker with City Edinburgh Council. I suppose for me, it's a question for the speakers, is I'm going to assume that the rocks will then melt in the sun, so there's going to be a finite amount of money available. And supposing there was an extra 200 million for additional taxation, how much of that would you spend on widening access, and how much would you spend on closing the attainment gap? Because the two of them's not mutually exclusive, obviously.
Well, I'm going to get, I think Lucy's taking lots of notes here, so I'm going to get Lucy to come back on that point at the end, if we may. But shall we, we got any more points? Want to do one more?
Just wanted to raise the issue of retention for the panel, because we know that the more elite the university, the higher the retention rate. But for widening access students within the most elite universities, they have the lowest retention rates. So it's not enough to admit people, you have to support them, and that costs money too.
Thank you. Any other points? Right at the back there.
Barry Moore, School Leader Scotland. It's just a very minor point, but having taught in the East End of Glasgow for 33 years, I know it is virtually impossible to convince our pupils from the west of Scotland to transfer to the east, and going to St Andrews, whether they are offered a place or not, they will not accept it. And it's a bit unfortunate to be blaming the universities for not bringing in people from widening access backgrounds when they are offered the places, but they just won't accept it. It's really just a comment rather than anything else. Thank you.
Okay, interesting point on the west-east divide. Anyone who hasn't? Shall I just say, is there anyone who hasn't made a point yet who really is aching to get in, and it's now your last chance to do so at the back there. We're keeping you fit with that microphone.
Hi, Kay Sellers, Unison Scotland. I suppose, having sat here all morning feeling quite depressed, why do you think people aren't more angry about this?
Okay, interesting question. Any other points before I come back to the panel? Last chance. Do you want to make one last point? But sorry, but over there, just there.
Pooja Parbacker, SRUC. I'd just like to make the point is also that I actually feel quite depressed listening to this today. It just seems like it's a problem that's never going to be solved, or how can it be solved? And there's so many other issues that need to be taken into consideration. So like the lady before, I echo it. What can be done? I'm not sure, but I just want to echo my feelings.
Okay. This is getting more interest now. So here and then just behind you as well. Yeah.
Hi, John Morrison. I'm doing a PhD in Edinburgh College of Art, but I'm interested in a particular demographic of care experienced students coming into higher education. And I was wondering if there was any data within the sets which we've examined which brings to light any new information around that particular demographic.
Okay. And just behind you there.
Thank you. Kirsty White from Audit Scotland. Apologies, this is not a question, it's a completely shameless plug. But while there's a captive audience, I just want to say Audit Scotland's been looking at higher education over the past 9 months, and we're due to publish a national report in early July looking at the system as a whole. It picks up some of the very interesting issues we've been discussing today, talks about money, so just to put the plug in early July. Thank you.
So there is some more data available, we gather. Anyone else who hasn't been in before we go back to panel at the back there?
Hello, I'm Michaela Malone from Admissions at University of Edinburgh. I was just wondering if any similar research had been done or planning to be done for access to postgraduate education.
That's an interesting point, and actually on the postgraduate, I mean, one of the things that the Sutton Trust has done was to show that I think over the last 15 years, the percentage of people with postgraduate degrees in the workforce in England had gone up from 4 to 11%. So we sort of see it as a bit of an escalating arms race, so that, you know, once you start making progress and getting undergraduate numbers changing a bit, then it moves up to the postgraduate numbers, and of course that gets more challenging. Any other points here? Any last points then? If I can see indications if anyone else wants to come in before I go back to the panel. Okay, so I'll take you first, sir.
Hi, just to answer to your point, I work at the Administrative Data Research Centre, Scotland, and we actually have a project that we've set up looked after children, in particular relating to placement stability and then educational outcomes. That's just to let you know.
And was there one back here, was there? Yes, here.
I am Sarah Morrison. I manage Liftoff, which runs the Schools for Higher Education programme in Fife and Tayside. I found this morning really interesting, and thanks very much to all the speakers. It's certainly given me a lot to think about. I just think as somebody who works operationally with young people in schools, the bit for me that's maybe missing a little bit here are some of the attitudes and misconceptions that young people and their parents have. And to be honest, also sometimes the messages that our young people are getting from teachers about what looks like success. I think it's quite difficult for young people to understand what success they should be striving towards at the moment, because success seems to be, doesn't seem to be quite clear, if that makes sense. There's a lot of confusion in our schools, and I just wanted to make that point.
Thanks. A good point to make. Anyone else who wants to come in? Did you have one last point you want to make?
Macroeconomic changes means that there's a growing difference between the top and bottom of the populations, and that those discrepancies are becoming ever wider. And so the distance that we have to jump to get people engaged in higher education becomes an ever more challenging gap. Do you think that we need to look at this in different and fresh ways?
Okay, well that's an interesting point to finish on. So I'm going to come back to the panel now too, and I know Lucy has been particularly beavering taking notes, so maybe we'll go to Lucy first and then see if the other panellists have got anything to add as well.
I'm going to take up Alan's very kind offer to give me £200 million to spend on improving education attainment, because that's just, I'm going to bite your arm off. I would spend most of it on schools. However, that's partly because it doesn't actually cost as much as you think to expand this. I think it's a very strange point, having made this. It costs about 7,000, maybe 10,000 to put a student through higher education per annum. That's if you stick in some student support, because we do that mainly as loan now, so assuming we're stuck with that. So actually for about, and we could improve our acceptance rate to university quite dramatically by adding about 10,000 places. So I don't need to spend anything like all your 200 million to give us some headroom in the system. So that's the first thing I do. In fact, I probably wouldn't just put in places. I've been thinking, I would talk about how could we just say we won't cap the recruitment of a certain group of students for a year or two, that kind of thing. Let's model what that might cost and how the behaviour of the universities, and I have to say you'd have to watch this, how the behaviour of the universities might respond. It might not do what you think. So you could expand the opportunity in higher education for much less than most of your 200 million. I have a soft spot for improving grants, but that costs a bit more. And I'm very conscious that although I think grants are important in dealing with unequal debt shares, which is my particular research interest, I can't prove to you they're actually that great for access, actually. So I would stick way over half your money in the school system. Unfortunately, however, it would get lost in there. We keep being told we're getting 750 million more for attainment over 5 years, but if you've been a civil servant in the Scottish Government and you know the size of the budgets, you also know those numbers sound bigger than sadly they are. But that's where I put it. Yeah, you can have more than half. I would pick up the lifelong learning point. I would also start the difficult conversation, yet again, that we try and start every few years in Scotland about the 4-year degree, because that soaks up a huge amount of our resource. It costs us way more to educate fewer people, because we take longer doing it. And people are terribly protective of the 4-year degree, and it's a can of worms. Maybe why you don't open this conversation. But you need to note it is part of why we can't have more people going through, is we take longer. I wanted to mention the care experienced point, because I know Who Cares Scotland had done a lot of work with Student Awards Agency to try and identify the numbers, they are pitifully tiny, of care experienced students who come through, and I was absolutely delighted that the Commission came out with the view that these young people, it was really shocking that we expected them to borrow most of their living costs to go through university, and that the government has accepted that point. And I think that, although it's a small number, I think that's a huge victory for sense and fairness. But the numbers are small. Who Cares Scotland are doing, I think, pretty good work here, quietly behind the scenes. Why aren't people more angry, Kay? I don't know. I'm quite angry. But I try and communicate that where I can. I think it's hard for people to get to grips with what's a really complicated story. Jim summarised it all beautifully. But you do have to ask people to understand there's more to it than one simple thing. So I think a lot of it's about debating. Well, I'm so glad that the Sutton Trust funded us for this, and this is the last point I'll make, and I'll pass on to others. Because I think that we've not had this debate in Scotland. It's felt as though if you wanted to raise any query for quite a long time about the nature of how we go about it, it's been incredibly hard, and the space simply hasn't been there. And it's been lovely to be in a room this morning where we've talked about it, and where people have come back with lots of really interesting, demanding questions, but what I've never felt at any point is that no one's querying the value of having this discussion. And I can't tell you from where I'm sitting, having observed this scenery for a while, how important I think that is as a first step. So I'll pass across now in case people want to talk about, there were some very particular points about HN transitions that people made, and lifelong learning, the invisibility of that, and adult returners. So I wonder if colleagues here want to add on any of those points.
I think just on the lifelong learners, because I have a particular interest in that area as well, having worked with Jim some time ago. I think it's incredibly difficult when you're looking at the kind of PIs and the kind of comparisons we're doing, that there aren't any indicators. They seem to have slipped off the radar. There are some, as I mentioned, but they don't get the attention that the young students get. And I think if you look at the elite institutions, something like 90, and in some of the most elite institutions, 95% of students are young. And you have to ask yourself whether that's because there aren't places for them, or because mature students don't want to go there. I would say the former rather than the latter, but it's very, very difficult for mature students to make an entry to those kind of places. And the data is far, far poorer. I knew there's a large survey, European survey, which looked at lifelong learning. And again, there's enormous variation in the way that the data is collected, which groups are focused on, and which groups disappear. So I think it's an important area, but I think it's difficult because of the lack of data. And I think it's difficult because we tend to forget about those groups because they're smaller numbers at the moment. I don't know whether that answers anything, but I think it's an important issue, which is why I wanted to raise the fact that they were missing in our discussion.
Thank you. Well, I would like to start off from the point about anger and why people aren't more angry about it. And I think it's because there is a middle-class complacency in Scotland, that the present policies in Scotland are working best for the most socially advantaged. So why should people, these are the people who have access to the media, articulate people. So I think that that's a very strong reason why there isn't more publicly expressed anger. And I think that the debate on tuition fees has got stuck in the fees, no fees system. You're either in favour of fees and the very, very bad English system, which actually is admitting more people from poorer backgrounds into university, or you're the much purer Scottish system, which has no fees, which predominantly benefits richer people who are getting favourable access to the most selective universities. And I think we need to look possibly, I would say, at a means testing system. We have means testing, after all, for grants and loans, but it's been completely unacceptable to think about means testing in terms of tuition fees. We have to remember that a significant minority in Scotland, 5% of the population, are paying a very large amount of money for their children's school education and are then getting university education for free, whereas there's unmet demand by people from poorer backgrounds. So personally, I would think that means testing tuition fees with contributions from people from from richer backgrounds would the other way around would actually be much better. And of course, we could have an income contingent system so that nobody pays anything up front, and repayment, as in England, is based on what you earn post-graduation. But this is not being discussed at all in Scotland. But it would begin to release some of the money for more investment, for an expansion of places in universities, but also it would mean more money for colleges and schools as well. And I would urge you to look at what will be happening soon in Wales, actually, when the Diamond Commission reports. I think that they will come up with some very interesting and imaginative ways of making the system work in a way which makes much more sense for social justice generally.
Thank you. And on that, sorry, Jim, would you like to? Yes, of course.
If I can. I'd just like to pick up one of your points. Picking up, again, starting with this, why are people not more angry? I think, as Sheila says, it was interesting, you quoted, you said that when some survey was done, that the free higher education got a very high level of support and providing money for better schooling, I think, at a relatively low level of support. I mean, I think this is the point that that in many ways the policies that are existing just now suit the more active members of our community. We like to tell ourselves that we're a society that's very, very committed to social justice. Unfortunately, I'm not sure the evidence is there to actually support that. And so I think that's part of the reason why people aren't more angry. But on a positive note, and this is what I was trying to say in relation to this business of what we can do about it. There are a lot of differences that we could make in policy that don't have to be radically different. The point that Lucy made there about the fact that for a relatively small sum of money, I mean, the Funding Council spends about £1 billion on higher education. Now, I mean, if you just take a very small part of that £1 billion and said, we're going to spend it on addressing some of these issues, you could make a huge difference. So you don't have to reinvent the world. You just have to ask yourself, what are the actual forms of policy intervention that could move things forward, and there are quite a lot. That's why I said policy can either make these things worse or they can make them better, and we have choices just now. So I think that's a crucial point. I think we should take away from that, and we should be making that point everywhere we can, that we don't have to just stick with what we've got. And that relates also to the HN thing, because, as I've said, I've been a great advocate of this system. But, going back to what I said there, that many HNs now are essentially not vocational qualifications. But if we constantly have this mantra that essentially they're vocational qualifications, we're not going to address the issue of how do we then say, if the vast majority of people who are doing an HND in business studies actually aspire to go on and do a degree in some form of business studies or computing, then we should recognise that and say, right, we're going to create a proper structure here. We have failed to actually do that. So there are quite limited things, I think, that we could do that would pick up on quite a lot of the issues here and could make the system a much better system than it is.
Thanks, Jim. And I think that's a very good note on which to end this morning's discussions. Thank you all for coming and thank you for participating. I believe lunch is going to be served in G21. And I'm sure this debate is going to Patterson's Land, right. So there's a map on the back of your programme. So can I thank you all for coming? Can I thank the researchers at the Centre for Research and Education, Inclusion and Diversity for their excellent report, and may this debate continue and hopefully lead to the sort of policy actions that Jim and others have been suggesting.